So welcome everyone to this webinar organized by the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, disrupting the narratives of the West Asian War. A couple of housekeeping notes straight away off the bat from me. During the entire session, the speakers will be speaking, and the moderator for this session will be Professor Junaid S. Ahmad. And in regards to questions, if you have any during the course of the event for the speakers, please use the Q&A function that is available below to ask your questions, and it will be directed to the speakers through our moderator. The only request we have is to keep the questions succinct and short so that we may be able to address as many questions as possible. So with regards to that, I don't want to take too much time. My name is Hasanal. I'm the Secretary General of the Movement for Liberation of Nakba, and I would like to welcome all our speakers as well. And without further ado, first, I would like to pass the floor to our esteemed moderator, Professor Junaid. Junaid, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Hassanal. So, good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone joining us from different parts of the world. On behalf of the Movement for Liberation from Nakba, or MLN, I warmly welcome you to this webinar, Disrupting the Narratives of the West Asian War. We're grateful to our speakers, participants, colleagues, comrades, and friends for joining this important conversation. Let me begin by briefly introducing MLN. The Movement for Liberation from Nakba is a coalition of organizations and individuals from across the world, including Palestine, South Africa, South Korea, Malaysia, India, Pakistan, Australia, New Zealand, Israel, and the United Kingdom. We came together to advance knowledge about Palestine, especially in the regions, communities, and intellectual spaces often called the Global South. Our work is rooted in education, awareness, and critical analysis. We seek to deepen understanding of historical Palestine, the 1948 Nakba, the Palestinian minority inside Israel, the occupied West Bank, the besieged Gaza Strip, and the continuing plight of millions of Palestinian refugees. At the heart of MLN's work is a clear conviction. Palestine must be understood not as an isolated conflict, nor merely as a dispute between two sides, but as a struggle against colonization, dispossession, racism, and the denial of fundamental rights. MLN serves as a platform for principled analysis of the Palestinian struggle against Zionist colonization. We hold that Zionism, as a political project of settler colonial domination and exclusion, is a form of racism. This position was once recognized by the United Nations in 1975 when many newly decolonized nations identified the continuing structures of colonialism and racism in both South Africa and Palestine. In the decades that followed, apartheid in South Africa came to be widely named and condemned. Yet Israel has often escaped comparable accountability through diplomatic power, political projection, and protection and narrative control. It has presented Zionism as self-determination while denying Palestinian self-determination, and it has sought to silence anti-Zionist critique by conflating it with anti-Semitism. Emlyn rejects these distortions. To be anti-Zionist is not to be anti-Jewish. To be anti-Zionist is to oppose colonialism, racism, dispossession, apartheid, and the ongoing Nakba inflicted upon the Palestinian people. Our aim is to place Palestine firmly within the framework of anti-colonialism, anti-racism, human rights, and international humanitarian law. We seek to center a narrative that affirms the Palestinian struggle for liberation from Israeli settler colonialism and for the continuing conditions of the Nakba. While MLN focuses on Palestine, we also recognize that Palestine speaks to the wider structures of domination in our world: racial capitalism, militarism, occupation, incarceration, medical apartheid, climate injustice, and economic dispossession. Each struggle has its own history and specificity, but each also carries a universal demand: dignity, freedom, justice, and self determination. And this brings us to the theme of today's webinar: disrupting the narratives on the West Asian War. We meet at a moment when the war in West Asia has expanded beyond Palestine into a wider regional confrontation, of course, including the US Israeli war on Iran, even as attempts are being made to negotiate some form of a peace deal, or at least a temporary pause in hostilities. The deeper structures of the crisis remain unresolved. Occupation, militarism, sanctions, imperial intervention, settler colonial violence, and the denial of self determination to the peoples of the region. For centuries, dominant narratives about West Asia have been produced from above by empires, colonial administrators, military establishments, corporate media, strategic think tanks, and powerful states. These narratives reduce the region to oil, terrorism, borders, fanaticism, instability, and security threats. They treat its peoples as objects to be managed, invaded, sanctioned, disciplined, or saved, rarely as subjects of history, resistance, thought, and political imagination. The language changes, but the structure remains. Colonial conquest was justified as civilization, occupation was justified as order, intervention was justified as democracy. Today, bombardment, siege, sanctions, and assassinations are justified through the language of security, counterterrorism, and self defense. The violence of the powerful is narrated as necessity. The resistance of the oppressed is narrated as extremism. But these narratives are now being disrupted. They're being disrupted by voices from below, Palestinians documenting their own dispossession, Iranians, Lebanese, Yemenis, Iraqis, Syrians, and others living under sanctions, occupation, and foreign intervention. Students, workers, writers, journalists, lawyers, faith leaders, feminists, indigenous movements, anti racist organizers, and ordinary people across the world who refuse the official story. From these locations, Palestine is not an exception, nor is Iran simply a security problem to be managed by Washington or Tel Aviv. The war in West Asia cannot be understood only through great power rivalry or regional instability. It must be understood through the lives of those who are bombed, displaced, occupied, sanctioned, imprisoned, surveilled, starved, and silenced, and through their refusal to disappear. This webinar invites us to think through the standpoint of the colonized, the besieged, the sanctioned, the displaced, from those who are resisting. And we gather to affirm another vocabulary, one grounded not in domination, but in liberation, not in imperial security, but in human dignity. With that spirit, I once again welcome you all to this webinar. May today's conversation help us think clearly, speak courageously, and act collectively in the struggle for justice in Palestine and beyond. With that, we'll go to our speakers, and I believe now that we have Professor Pape back from the airport, we will begin. Professor Ilan Pape, or Stad Ilan, is an Israeli historian and one of the leading scholars of Palestinian history. His research focuses on the history of Palestine and Israel, settler colonialism, ethnic cleansing, nationalism, and historical memory. As a member of the New Historians movement, he has challenged traditional narratives surrounding the creation of Israel and the displacement of Palestinians in 1948. He currently serves as a professor and is involved in Palestinian studies and decolonial scholarship at the University of Exeter. There's so much more that can be said about Professor Ilan Pape. I would love to say it, but in the interest of time, maybe I'll say it later. Please, Professor Ilan Pape, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Junaid, for your kind introduction. Thank you, Phyllis and Mariam, for joining us. I know both of you are very busy, and we are honored to have you with us. Thank you for the MLN team, Khalisha and Hassanel, for making this possible. I do believe that there's a lot of webinars and discussion in the global north, especially in the English speaking world. But of course, this is not the whole world. And we're so happy that we were managed in the years that we exist to reach people in Africa in Southeast Asia, in Australia, in New Zealand, who are very eager to be part of the conversation, very eager to contribute to the struggle for justice and freedom in Palestine, and belong to countries that hopefully one day would play a more positive role in our future in historical Palestine, and balance the very negative impact that Western powers had for more than 120 years on our life, our fate, and our existence. Uh, I think one of the biggest challenge for disrupting the narrative, and I find it again and again, even when I extended my discussions either in person or online with people in the global South, in Africa, in Southeast Asia, and Latin America, is really to have the patience to understand that while I'm in the bubble of with my colleagues who are activists or academics, who are Palestinians, who are pro-Palestinians, you sense that some things are so obvious that they don't have to be articulated because it's very clear. And then you go to these places and you still hear from people in positions of power the same narrative that you thought, because you were involved with other like-minded people, was already disrupted. So I think my first point is that, unfortunately, and as maybe as ridiculously as it is, despite all the information that we have about the history, despite all the explicit information and data that we have from the present reality in Palestine, whether it is from the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, or from, as Junaid rightly said, from Lebanon, Syria, and Iran, that despite this very explicit proof for the brutality of the Zionist regime, its policies on the ground, its how its ideology is translated into acts of genocide, ethnic cleansing, and dispossession. Despite all of that, you can still hear from people, as I said, who either potentially have the power to influence policies or are part of the policy making apparatus, or part of the mainstream media and academia in these places, that still stick to the narrative in a totally irrelevant way to the realities on the ground, whether in the past or in the present. I'm sorry. And I think that despite the great work we've all done, and it's one of the reasons I joined groups such as the MLN to think together, because no one person can do it, is to not to say to ourselves, well, we disrupted the narrative, but the narrative is still there to be disrupted in places where we haven't reached as yet. It's very clear that large sections of the civil society all over the world, are far more knowledgeable now about the reality. And that was translated to a huge movement of solidarity, especially after the 7th of October, in numbers and in magnitude that we haven't seen before. But yet, even that kind of solidarity from below, as we know, have not as yet affected the policy from above. And one of the shields that of immunity for Israel, or one of the reasons that this energy from below that demands governments to take action against Israel and its destructive policies towards the Palestinians is the narrative that is being conveyed as a proof for, or as a justification for, either inaction or in some cases complicity with Israeli actions, which means that we have to go back and continue to disrupt the narrative in various contexts, in various circles, I would say, or domain of information and knowledge. It is important to go back to the past. It's very easy to kind of to hear people saying, well, the past is irrelevant. Let's focus of what's going on now and let's focus about the future. But the whole strategy towards the reality in the present and in the future cannot be properly formulated, cannot be properly discussed without understanding the foundation of the project of Zionism, not in a conversation between us, but in a conversation between the people that we would like still to convince, to persuade, to engage with the reality, with maybe on my part a naive belief that some of them at least, are holding on to views and policies that help the Zionist state, or at least are indifferent towards it, not because of their cynicism, their the interests, either ideological or financial or economic. Of course, this is always true about such position, but because there is a need to confront them with realities and not to give up. And of course, the domain for such a conversation is not necessarily only the political domain. This has to do with universities, education, how to teach, how to research the history of Zionism in Palestine. And sometimes you have to go back to the fundamentals, as tiring and exhausting it is, and insist on it, so that the the origin of the violence in Palestine would be recognized as a Zionist colonization, that the futility and invalidity and immorality of the idea of planting a European Jewish state at the heart of the Arab world was a terrible idea when it was conceived, and it could only be implemented by coercion and violence, and could only be maintained by coercion and violence. And of course, it triggered an anti-colonialist resistance movement. It would have happened anywhere in the world with any indigenous people being colonized by Europeans. And Junaid rightly said, this has to do a lot with the language that we use and the vocabulary that we should insist on, even if that vocabulary is now delegitimized in some countries as equivalent to anti-Semitism or support for terrorism. Maybe actually this reaction to words, to slogans, to sound bites that are much more truthfully based on the reality shows that there is a fear among those who support the state of Israel that these words might become used more frequently and would be understood as the right language that has to be used in order to describe the reality in the past and in the present, and draw from this the right conclusion for the future. I still think that at the same time, and with this I would finish, I don't want to take more of the time that I have. At the same time, of course, and not in a way that excludes the deeper conversation about Zionism, its ideology, its history, and everything it done in Palestine, is of course disrupting the narrative of the particularly of the recent events that we have in the last 3 years. I must say, at least while I'm disappointed in all my engagement from the way that we still need to disrupt the narrative about Zionism as a national movement, about Israel as a democracy, about the Palestinian as acts of terrorism. At least the absurdity of the narrative provided for the unprovoked American-Israeli attack on Iran is more, I find it, I don't know what the other people think, it would be interesting. I find it much easier to disrupt. And because it's easy to disrupt and to say, this is an aggression that was meant to, first of all, help two politicians in the moment of crisis. It served a multinational corporation and financial interests. It was meant as a distraction from the Palestine question, and it's a translation of the ideology of the present political elite in Israel, an ideology that explicitly talks about recreating what they call the biblical kingdom of Israel through ethnic cleansing, genocide, really reenacting a kind of an historical period as they understand it that led to the most glorious moment in the, as they see it, in the history of Judaism. This is a very dangerous group of people with hundreds of nuclear weapons, with, so far at least, American unconditional support. And we can see the result in the destructions in Lebanon, in Palestine, in Iran. They have recently made 6 new million refugees destitute in the West Bank, in the Gaza Strip, in Lebanon, and in Iran itself. So on the one hand, yes, that particular narrative is really not working. It seems that even, I don't know, Phyllis knows about it more than I do, but I feel that even people in the Republican Party do not buy that narrative anymore about the necessity of that war and the usefulness even from an American perspective. But the fact that this lie is so much there in the open, and yet the genocide in Gaza continues. The ethnic cleansing in the West Bank continues. The ethnic cleansing in Lebanon continues. Probably we need a different conversation, and I won't start it, that there is something about this international political system, the international legal system, of course, international economic system, that makes it, unfortunately, less conducive to disrupting narratives as a tool to achieve justice. We probably need something additional to disrupting the narrative. And of course, it starts and ends with having the Palestinian leading the conversation of what should be done, what they want from us in the solidarity movement. And we should listen and find the ways of shortening this worst chapter in the history of modern Palestine. And I do believe, and with this I would end, I do believe that this is not going to sustain for long. I think this kind of Israel, the way it evolved, and maybe it was inevitable that it evolved in such a way, is not going to be sustained in the long run. And you can already see the cracks in the foundation of that state. But it will take time. And this is not something Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank have right now. So we have to find a way of both extending the cracks in the building so that it collapses, and there is a chance for building something much better, and at the same time, at least tame the ruthlessness, the aggression, and the violence inflicted by Israel, not only on the Palestinians now, but of so many other people in the region. Thank you for the time, Junayed, and I pass the floor to the next speaker, to you, and from there to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Pape. I think many people have been reading and listening to you since, well, long before, I hope, the recent phase of the genocide in Gaza, and specifically to your analysis of this final phase of Zionism, and some people a bit skeptical of it. I think that perhaps now it's may happen even faster than what you've predicted. And in some ways, that you're seeing those contradictions and tensions happening even in the United States. And I agree that perhaps Phyllis can speak on that and give us that analysis. But before Phyllis, let's have Dr. Chandra Muzaffar speak. Very quick introduction. Dr. Chandra is the president of the International Movement for a Just World, JUST, which I'm a proud member of myself, which is an international NGO based in Malaysia and which seeks to critique global injustice and to develop an alternative vision for a just and compassionate civilization guided by universal spiritual and moral values. He's published extensively on civilizational dialogue, international politics, religion, human rights, and Malaysian society. He's the author and editor of 32 books in English and Malay. Many of his writings have been translated into other languages. Among his publications are A World in Crisis, Is There a Cure? And Reflections on Malaysian Unity and Other Challenges. And there's so much more, like Professor Pape, that I can say about Dr. Chandra, who's always been one of the leading mentors of myself. So, but in the interest of time, we'll let Dr. Chandra give his remarks. So please, Dr. Chandra, you can, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Junaid. Now, what I'll do is look at the 14-point Memorandum of Understanding, because that is the latest and the most important event that we should be focusing on. I won't take up too much time, but just to offer some preliminary thoughts on that memorandum, and also the sort of positions which are bound to emerge in relation to that memorandum over the next few months, and perhaps even way beyond the 60-day period. Now, there are, to my mind, perhaps 5 critical points within the Memorandum of Understanding. I shall look at each of them very quickly and draw some conclusions. First, the memorandum talks about a cessation of hostilities, fighting, killings, and destruction in the area that we know as West Asia. And it emphasizes the importance of bringing all these disruptions to an end. Now, that is positive, that there is a commitment to bringing to an end the killings, largely of innocent people, and the destruction of infrastructure and the impact that both the killings and the destruction of infrastructure have had upon not just Palestine or West Asia, but the global arena as a whole. So that's something positive, that there is a commitment and attempt to bring to an end the killings and devastation. Number 2, if one looks at the 14-point MOU, there is also an attempt to come to grips with the question of nuclear weapons in that region. And of course, the focus is on Iran and why this is important. This is not disputed by anyone. If we're talking about the danger of nuclear weapons, not only in that part of the world, but anywhere in the world, it is something that we have to emphasize. I'm hoping that this concern with the possession and use of nuclear weapons by Iran and certain other states in that region will also compel all of us to look at the one state that already has a full array of nuclear weapons in that region, and that's Israel. In a sense, it's a pity that it's not mentioned at all in the Memorandum of Understanding or in many of the discussions about the situation in West Asia. People talk about nuclear weapons, but they'll always avoid pinpointing Israel. I've often argued that if we are concerned about weapons of mass destruction, about its impact upon West Asia, we have to begin with Israel. Why that is a major challenge, because it tells us a lot about the situation in that region. Why certain countries may be thinking about nuclear weapons and the role of Israel. So it's good that at least this is mentioned. It gives us an opening to focus upon the one state that possesses nuclear weapons in that region, which is also the one state that is participated in the largest number of wars in that region. At the moment, for instance, if you look at Israel, Israel is involved in wars in about 6 states in that region. And that's Israel's track record. And it's a pity, as I said a while ago, that whenever people talk about West Asia, they talk about all the other culprits, but they don't talk about Israel. But that's something which, if you want a genuine solution, you have to do it, because that's the root problem. Israel and its aggressive, belligerent approach to politics in that region. Now, third aspect of the Memorandum of Understanding, which is important, is it does also talk about the impact of what has happened in recent weeks, Straits of Hormuz, and all the rest of it, upon the energy market. This led to the spike in energy prices, and this had a devastating impact all over the world. So there is a commitment to addressing this issue, and that is important. The Memorandum of Understanding is also important for another reason. It realizes that the impact of the new energy price structure and the impact upon what has happened to the Straits of Hormuz is also related to the general global economy. It's not just energy, which we should be concerned about. For a lot of people in the global south, fertilizer prices have gone up. It's right in the midst of the planting season. And this is also something very destructive. So there is an attempt to look at that issue also. Now, the MOU also talks about the changes that have taken place in relations among states in that region as a result of all that has happened recently, and how it's going to change the geopolitics of the region. And that's true. One can argue that in terms of geopolitics, the MOU does recognize that with what has happened, new actors have become more important in that region. And those new actors are not the earlier players are going to set the tone and tenor for the future in that part of the world. To be more specific, the United States of America and its close ally, Israel, they become less important. And we have to recognize that. So in terms of trying to work out relations in the coming months and years, players like Iran and Turkey, and even other players like Qatar, and perhaps even Pakistan, would be more important. So the MOU is cognizant of all this, of the impact on a number of different dimensions of the situation in West Asia. So I would say that it is an important document in that sense. If it is implemented sincerely, it can lead to important changes. It can lead to a situation where some of our earlier problems would be resolved to some extent, and we would be able to see perhaps new combinations and permutations in regional and international politics. That's if it is implemented sincerely. But like many others, I'm also very skeptical about whether the MOU will be able to have the impact that it potentially can have on the region. Because there are major opponents to the MOU, and they'll go all out to destroy this MOU, because what is involved are vested interests that are so fundamental to certain actors and to the larger region that they will not want the MOU to be implemented in an honest manner. One major opponent is, of course, Israel. Israel is not even mentioned. Israel is totally against any attempt to establish good relations with Iran, with some other countries in the region. Israel would like the wars in that area to continue because it knows that it benefits from these wars. And for that reason, we should watch out for this development more than anything else. How Israel is going to sabotage the MOU. It's very early in the day. I mean, it's just 2 or 3 days old, but let's keep this in mind. The role that Israel will play in sabotaging the MOU and how other actors will react, especially the United States of America, apart from some of the other actors, when they find that Israel is determined to scuttle this arrangement. It's not just Israel. I think the Trump leadership, the Donald Trump government is also not very happy with the MOU, even though it is a signatory and it gives the impression that it supports it. I think it has a certain interpretation of the memorandum. And if that interpretation doesn't emerge, it doesn't surface, I think the Trump administration will also try to sabotage the MOU. Even within Iran, there are elements, as we have seen in the media in the last 48 hours, that are against the MOU because they feel that Iran has agreed to a peace deal or to the pursuit of a peace deal too soon, and it's against Iran's interests. So there are all these opponents to the MOU, and it is that opposition that will matter more than anything else in the next few weeks. Don't forget that if you look at the history of that region, actors like Israel and the United States and others, Egypt at a different time, and some of the other countries here, they have undermined peace efforts, and that will continue. And that's going to be a very big challenge for us. What do we do in a situation like this? I think the general public has got a very big role to play. It is a pity that foreign policy and the relations between states very often do not include ordinary people. They have no role. They don't impact upon developments like this. And yet it's ordinary people who bear the brunt of what will happen in the end. Which is why I think people should speak up. More and more groups should speak up and say, well, there are positive elements in this MOU, and we know what the landmines are, and we'd like to see it succeed. They should write, they should analyze, especially people in the United States and the West, in support of the MOU, for what it's worth, in spite of all its shortcomings. At least push for this, because what's the alternative? The alternative is continuing tension, friction, and destruction, which none of us want to see. So we have a role, all of us, we have a role, which is very important. But at the same time, we must realize that that region of the world has been the main determining force in global politics for quite a while. It is West Asia, politics of West Asia, that determines global politics. And we cannot keep quiet if we are concerned about the future of humankind. We have to play a role. We have to do what little we can. It isn't very much that we can do, but we have to do what little we can to at least ensure that peace has a chance. Because if we're not able to settle some of the root problems in that region soon, meaning by which this is an opportunity. The 60 days are important because some of the most critical issues that are not even mentioned in the MOU, they will have to be addressed in the next 60 days, including friends, a very, very important issue not addressed in the MOU, the question of Palestine. We should have a firm commitment to the creation of a Palestinian state. There are two states that are totally opposed to it, and both of them have had the upper hand so far on the question of Palestine, the United States and Israel. Most of the other states agree with the creation of a Palestinian state. But how is it that these two states are able to determine what will happen? This is where I think public opinion is important. People should mobilize, people should organize, people should articulate, people should try to do what they can. After all these years of seeing how states have failed and terrible destruction that has happened, one of the greatest disruptions in human history actually is associated with the creation of Israel. 875,000 people expelled from their homes right at the time of its birth. People don't even talk about this. What has happened in the case of Palestine and what the creation of Israel has led to. In fact, right from the beginning, Israel enjoyed impunity. And it's impunity which is the reason why we've had all these wars. Because no one questions Israel, there's basically no one questioning the United States of America because of the link between the two. How do you resolve the problem of war, of destruction and devastation, if you're not prepared to address issues pertaining to both US hegemony and Israeli hegemony within that region? And that's what we must be prepared to do. And that's what we have been trying to do through JUST and MLN and SHAPE and other organizations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Chanda. So much there. Hopefully, we can get to some of it in our discussion. But let me now introduce Phyllis Bennis. She is a fellow of the Institute for Policy Studies in Washington, D.C., focusing primarily on Palestinian rights, international law, and the UN, and ending U.S. wars and empire. She serves as international advisor to Jewish Voices for Peace, has been an informal advisor to several UN officials on Palestine, and works with international partners in South Africa and Palestine. She co-founded the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights in 2001 and helped build U.S. and global coalitions against the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. She speaks widely across the U.S. and globally and writes in a variety of venues. Her most recent book is Understanding Palestine and Israel. Phyllis, we are all huge admirers of yours, and you have written primers for, it seems like, all of the major conflicts over the past 2 or 3 decades. Myself, my students, we are just huge admirers, and we have learned so much from the incredible work you've done. So please, the floor is yours, and welcome.
Thanks very much, Junaid, and thanks for that lovely introduction. Thanks to JUST and MLN for organizing it, especially Khalisa and Hassanal for doing the grunt work of putting it all together, the hard part. So thank you all. You know, what I was going to speak about just briefly is the question of why the US with Israel went to war in Iran recently, why the illegality of that war matters, and what we might think about doing about it. And I'm glad that both Ilan and Chandra have raised all those similar questions in their presentations. So I'll try a bit to build on what they have said. You know, we're speaking today, whether it's morning, afternoon, or evening where you are, we're speaking today in the context of rising fascism and rising and consolidating authoritarianism in many parts of the world, especially in the United States, because what happens in the United States, which despite weakening in recent periods remains a very dominant superpower globally, that matters a great deal. Ilan spoke of how the narratives are understood and not understood. In the US, we've seen in recent years an enormous shift in the discourse shift on Palestine. For the first time, we saw hundreds of thousands of people pouring into the streets to protest the genocide in Gaza in the first weeks, the first days of the genocide after October 7. And we've seen that shift in the mainstream media, as weak as it still is. The shift has been enormous from where it once was. What we're not seeing is a policy shift yet. We are seeing for the first time after I've been involved in this movement for decades, and I've never seen the discourse shift process reach the halls of Congress. But it's not yet enough to actually change the US policy. And when we are dealing with an issue of authoritarianism on the rise, it means that the democratic character of what popular opinion, what public narrative means, doesn't work so well. So the discourse shift is not enough to lead to a change in the actual policy. So that's the challenge that we face, is how to transform that discourse shift into an actual policy shift so that people on the ground feel it. Because right now what we're dealing with is a situation where we've never had such extraordinary opportunities and indeed successes at changing people's minds at a massive level across the United States. 77% of voters in the Democratic Party, for instance, now say no more aid to Israel, no more military aid to Israel. That's never happened. I never dreamed we would see numbers like that. But it has not yet hit the leadership of the Democratic Party, for instance. The Republican Party has a closer relationship between the base and the electeds, but it's all on the negative side. So we're still in that major struggle. So turning to the immediate crisis that we're dealing with in Iran, I think it is important to recognize the origins of this war in Iran in the Gaza genocide, not just because of the broad politics of West Asia, politics of the region, but the specifics because of the impunity that Israel and the United States achieved in carrying out this genocide for the last 2.5 years. It was assumed that that impunity would apply this time as well. It was assumed accurately because the US had always guaranteed the protection, the impunity for Israel, no matter what war crimes, crimes against humanity were created. Now, there are multiple reasons in US politics of why the Trump administration went to war against Iran in this period. Some of them are personal and have to do with personnel within that administration. For Trump himself, the obsession with the projection of power for the United States after what he saw as his success in Venezuela, for instance. The Secretary of War, as he likes to call himself, Hegseth, his obsession with the appearance of the military, the appearance of this massive group of soldiers he gets to command, that played a role. The obsession of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, with Cuba, sees this very much as a step towards the overthrow of the regime in Cuba that has been his goal for decades. All of those reasons played a part. But there are also reasons that have to do with the legacy of US imperialism in the world. And in that context, what this war was all about was to both strengthen and demonstrate hegemony. For Israel, the question of regional hegemony throughout West Asia or the Middle East, as it's known in the United States, of course, given the colonial history of our language. And for the United States, the global hegemony. This war was designed to consolidate that and to show it off to the world. Just don't forget who's calling the shots here. Both, as a result, wanted the war. That allied, of course, with the political particularities of Trump and Netanyahu, who were both facing challenges politically in their coming elections. Both wanted the war for their own reasons, but it is rooted still in this question of hegemony. And the timing worked out because of that impunity in Gaza. So there was a link in this war both to Gaza directly and to Lebanon in the context of the Lebanese through Hezbollah, showing solidarity with Gaza in the context of the genocide and Israel's brutal response and reoccupation now of South Lebanon in particular, but its attacks on all of Lebanon, including in Beirut, in the capital. What happened, of course, is that in this war that was designed to both strengthen and demonstrate US and Israeli hegemony, regional and global, was that they failed. They didn't reach these goals. The US goals officially, they switched around a lot. You'll all remember the variety of goals that we heard from the Trump administration. We're going to destroy their nuclear program, despite claiming that 6 months earlier they had already destroyed the nuclear program, which, of course, US officials, intelligence officers themselves, the official US position is still Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, is not building a nuclear weapon, and has never made the decision to try to create a nuclear weapon. But despite that, the goal was to destroy Iran's nuclear program. It was also to destroy their nuclear capacity, their missile capacity, that it would destroy all of Iran's missiles. It would destroy Iran's navy. It would prevent Iran from having support, from providing support to its regional allies. And it would maybe result in real regime change. All of these were tossed around at various points. What they got in return was none of those things. They got a return to the status quo ante before this war began. So the big accomplishment, maybe, and we should be clear, the negotiations were supposed to begin a few hours ago. So far, nobody has even showed up in Geneva. So we don't even know if this MOU is in fact going to lead to actual negotiations on some of the issues that Chandra has mentioned. But assuming that they do, what they got in return was a return to the status quo. The strait will be opened. Well, that's fine. That's a good thing. The strait was open before this war. Iran had always had the power to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Somebody sent me recently a video I had, of course, had no idea existed, of a speech I gave in 2007, where I talked about the possibility that if this was when the Bush administration was openly considering threatening war against Iran, and one of the things we were trying to do was to say what could happen in response, one of the things we talked about was Iran could shut down the Strait of Hormuz. So this notion that nobody ever imagined Iran would shut down the Strait of Hormuz, it's like, excuse me, a lot of us talked about that for a long time. That's nothing new. But we would have the strait reopened. That's a good thing. It was already open. And there would be an Iranian promise never to produce nukes. Well, we've already had that. That was not only in the JCPOA and the earlier nuclear deal between the United States and a variety of other countries and the United Nations with Iran from 2015, but it's also been the Iranian position for years, certainly since the overthrow of the Shah, who, of course, was moving towards greater nuclearization at the behest of the United States. So all of this was just going back to what happened before the war. So the 3,600 people at least that have been killed in Iran, the 3,700 people at least that have been killed by Israel in Lebanon throughout this war, the people that were killed, the much smaller numbers of people who were killed by Israel in Gaza in the context of this war, and the tiny numbers of people, thankfully, it's better this way, of course, that both in the Gulf states and in Israel, the small numbers of people that were killed, none of those people had to die to achieve those two things, the opening of the Strait of Hormuz and an agreement by Iran not to produce nuclear weapons. That already existed. I'm not going to go through all of the goals and all of that. Chandra did a brilliant job of pointing to what's important and what's not. But briefly, I want to touch on this question of illegality. It's not something new and different to say, oh my God, this war in Iran was illegal. Of course it was illegal. Of course it violated international law. And in the US, which waged the war with Israel, a complete violation of US domestic law that says only the Congress, only the Parliament in the United States has the right under our Constitution to declare war. The Trump administration pretended that doesn't even exist. Unlike, we should say, even in the earlier wars, the illegal wars, in my view, in both Iraq and Afghanistan, the Bush administration acknowledged that there were laws that prohibited going to war unless certain circumstances were met. So on the domestic front, they got the Congress to agree to authorize the use of military force, both in Afghanistan and later in Iraq. They also acknowledged that they needed the support of the United Nations Security Council, that the only way, when there was no issue here in Iraq of self-defense being an issue, the only way they could legally go to war would be if the Security Council endorsed it. And they said that, and they tried for months, but for 8 months, the Security Council of the United Nations stood defiant of the Bush administration. It was an astonishing thing, what became known as the uncommitted six in the Security Council refused to go along with US pressure. These were not powerful countries. These were countries that, under ordinary circumstances, could not stand up against US pressure in the UN or elsewhere. But because there was a global movement, a people's movement, that was flooding the capitals all around the world, including of those 6 countries, which were, if I can remember them all, it was Pakistan, Chile, Angola, I'm afraid I'm not. I used to be able to do this really well, and now I can't name all 6. Mexico, 6 countries of the global south that said no, that said we are not going to give in for 8 months. And eventually the US and the Brits said, okay, we can't get a resolution from the Security Council. We're just going to go without it. They were in complete violation of international law. but they did not deny that the international law exists. This war was based on a declaration by the United States that there was no international law. Trump said explicitly that the only constraint on his power was what he called, quote, my own morality. I don't need international law, he said. It was extraordinary. That had never happened before. And that's what makes this illegality so dangerous, so dangerous. And unfortunately, it has been somewhat successful. No one in the international arena right now is focusing on the illegality of launching this war of aggression, this war crime of this war in Iran. They're saying, well, it was without any reason. They didn't have any reason to do it. It was a chosen war. That's all true, and that's all irrelevant. What's relevant is this was an illegal war that violated international law in a host of ways. The Secretary of Defense, Secretary of War, he likes to say, said, we will not abide by, quote, no stupid rules of engagement. It was designed to be an illegal war. Based on the Nuremberg precedent, this was a classic war of aggression. So the deepening of international law is one of the really dangerous aspects of this war, beyond the killing of so many civilians. We're not hearing about that either. We're talking about in the Western press, particularly in my country, we're talking about the cost of war in raising the price of gasoline in the US, which is huge for poor people in this country. And that includes about 140 million people in my country who are living just at or just barely above or way below our poverty line. That's not a false claim. But in the rest of the world, the impact is so much more brutal, both in terms of direct hunger. People are now, children especially, and elders, the most vulnerable, are dying of starvation because they are eating one meal a day, because farmers are not able to grow their crops because they can't get what? They can't get the fuel-based kind of materials they need for their growing crops. And when people can't get the fertilizer and whatever else they need, there's not enough food. So this is a global crisis for poor people. And what we're looking at is that international law so far has not been able to enforce any kind of rulings. The fear of so many governments against what the Trump administration is likely to do is getting worse. The challenge of enforcement is what faces us on the issue of what does civil society need to do at this stage. And what I would point to here, and I want to end with this because I think it is important that we keep our focus on what we can do, as Chandra and Ilan both spoke to. The question of Israeli exceptionalism, Israeli impunity, how US power has protected Israel, not only with the billions of dollars every year given to the Israeli military. I don't know if people are aware that in 2024, for instance, the first full year of the genocide, United States taxpayers, people like me, were paying for 40% of Israel's entire military budget. That's unprecedented anywhere in the world with any relationship between any countries. But it wasn't even noticed. It was just passed without notice in Congress. They voted for it. The Trump administration announced it proudly, and it wasn't considered an issue. That kind of protection, the financial protection, the provision of arms, all the most modern arms, the most powerful arms in the US arsenal are made available to the Israeli military and not to any other in the country, any other in the world. The US Congress has passed laws that said it is obligated to make sure that the Israeli military power is greater than any combination of any regional challengers to Israeli power. So that kind of protection from the United States makes our work in enforcing international law much harder. We've seen important developments. The move that South Africa made to go to the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, and demand that Israel be held accountable for its violations of the International Covenant Against Genocide. was unprecedented and vitally important historically for a whole host of reasons. One, the possibility of actually holding Israel accountable. Two, challenging the notion that it's only the white colonial countries that have the right to demand of institutions like the ICJ or the UN Security Council or the ICC. All of these institutions were envisioned to be the domain of the colonial powers. And what South Africa did was show that's just not true. That the countries of the global south, the countries of Africa, and in particular, this rainbow nation that had itself defeated apartheid in the context of a huge global movement that was part of what made the overthrow of apartheid possible, that it too could use the institutions of international law. And against many predictions, the court came through in its preliminary rulings that said this is potentially a violation of the crime of genocide. And it imposed provisional measures. We haven't yet seen the final decision, but it was a provisional ruling and provisional measures that started with stop the killing in Gaza. And as we know, Israel stood defiant, said we're not bound by that, ignored it, and the genocide has continued. The resolution of the General Assembly that was designed to enforce the ICJ resolution, because the enforcement is not possible by the court itself. The court has no army, it has no police force, it doesn't even have a process server who could go around the world and serve the papers on these various violators of international law. But the United Nations does, and it went to the General Assembly under the Uniting for Peace precedent, and which passed an extraordinary resolution that called for sanctions, that called for banking restrictions, trade sanctions, sports sanctions, cultural sanctions, economic sanctions, and most importantly, for an arms embargo. So all of the decisions by the United States to continue sending arms is in violation of the UN decisions. Now, this was the UN General Assembly, the most democratic part of the UN, even though it doesn't have the right of enforcement in international law. What it has is the most democratic legitimacy of any part of the United Nations. And as a result, people around the world, like we did in the era of South African apartheid, was to go back to their own capitals, holding up this list, this menu, if you will, of sanctions and actions that international law now says should be carried out by every state. It's not enforceable by force of law, but it is enforceable by the power of global movements, of social movements, the same movement that brought somewhere between 16 and 18 million people into the streets of capitals around the world on the same day, on February 15th of 2003, when the world said no to war against Iraq. We need that same kind of mobilization, the same kind of mobilization that we saw with the movement against apartheid in South Africa, that finally brought enough pressure to bear on enough countries that they imposed sanctions, which brought enough pressure on the United States that the anti-apartheid movement in the United States was able finally to claim that victory and get US sanctions against South Africa, which made possible what the South Africans could do for themselves, which was to overthrow apartheid. The challenge we face is that we are facing a genocide, and that's what makes it necessary for us to move ahead with more power than ever as a global movement.
Thank you so much, Phyllis. I was just thinking that folks that want to know about the relationship of the United States and Israel, please just watch this webinar, and you don't have to go and see Tucker Carlson, because we have really laid out all of our speakers. We've laid out. Okay, thank you for that, Phyllis. And finally, we're very, very honored to have Mariam Barghouti with us. She's a Palestinian journalist, writer, and researcher whose work centers on Palestine, human rights, media narratives, and political developments in the occupied Palestinian territories. Known for on-the-ground reporting from the West Bank, she examines issues such as military occupation, censorship, displacement, and the role of media in shaping public understanding of Palestine. Her work has appeared in major international outlets, including CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, The Guardian, and The New York Times. Mariam, welcome. It's good to have you with us. And please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here. And, as I was listening also, I'm not sure what further, I can add. That was very well explained. And, we are at a place of crisis, unfortunately. But perhaps I can give a little tidbit about just the different frameworks that we are also raising. And I am not an academic, right? So I am bringing it more from my perspective in the work of media, at least, and just seeing the impacts of, policy and decision making on the lived experience, but also how things are being perceived, right? One of the critical issues that we're constantly seeing and reflecting is that perhaps there isn't changes in policy and behavioral practices because there isn't a language of urgency when we are reporting on places like Palestine, when we are reporting on places like Lebanon, the global south, and Iran. But if we look at the difference is when places like Israel are attacked, when we saw what happened on October 7th, there was this language of urgency and hyper alarming for the right to defense. And what this means is that for people like Palestinians, it meant that we just continued having to endure constantly and consistently without reflection by global hegemon on what is happening here, right? But what that also brings us towards is recognizing that this lack of language of urgency does not come in a vacuum. It comes from the entire concept and framework of defense that has been pushed forward. And when I want to bring to kind of attentions also that when we are bringing into light issues in international law and the need for legality and the perception of illegality in how places like Israel and the US are acting, that there is a problem in that because the entire framework of international law is also designed to see things through the perspective of states, right? But what we're actually seeing in practice is that the US, Europe, Israel, they're more behaving like a mafia. They're more behaving like international organized crime syndicates. And I don't think international law is applying a framework, which there is a framework for that, to them, that it continues to treat them as states, which makes it difficult for holding accountability because you have things like heads of state have immunity and certain types of protections that allow them to avoid accountability when I think they really should be treated as rogue regimes and organized crime syndicates. But these things and these ideas is, what we are seeing, especially, and Phyllis was mentioning this earlier, but there was a shift in discourse, right? And this shift of discourse happened because people were finally exposed and allowed access to information because there are these aspects of the engineering of ignorance domestically in places like the US, in the UK, in Europe, especially. And yet these are also not looked at as criminal offenses by the governments themselves, right? So as Palestinians, we're constantly highlighting the complicity of media. We're constantly reporting how there is a distortion of information. But all of that is also to emphasize that it is first and foremost a crime against the respective populations in those spaces. And it needs to be approached as that, that it's not just about us Palestinians and the implications of this ignorance, but it is a crime against people because this is where the manufacturing of consent comes in, right? And I think that's something that's important to be discussed, in that a lot of these conversations that we do have on global developments, on political state of affairs, are either confined to academic spaces or the spaces of, policymakers. And that poses a problem in what it means to engaging the public and making it accessible and also simplifying things, because part of the colonial control has often been confusing, right, things, using strategic ambiguity and jargon to deny people the spaces of engagement. And that's part of how legal frameworks work as well. That's why you, as lawyers, they need to find loopholes, things like that, in order to promote and push for justice. So it's looking at how things are being relayed, where the conversations are happening, and what is being taken as serious or not. Because I think especially policymakers have refused to listen to the public, because more often than not, it was reduced to, oh, that's just the language of activists, rather than, this is what the public demands, and we are representatives of public interests, and that's what we need to do. So there is a need to, I think, also look at this in any conversation that we bring up, on the political reality that we are witnessing. And now with that, I'm gonna try and to move towards what I've personally learned and what we learned in the state of media through what we saw with Iran. One really important aspect that I think is also not addressed enough is the addressing of issues like the war in Iran and Lebanon. Even with Israel's attacks on Gaza, they're addressed in silos or in isolations, not as continuums of each other, right? Not recognizing that, for example, Israel's declaration of a preemptive strike on Iran came in a framework where it was intensifying and escalating its territorial conquest in the West Bank, as well as Gaza, and now in Lebanon and Syria. So there were multi-fronted goals of that war with Iran. Of them is territorial conquest, which we saw and was not addressed in the discussions of the war with Iran. The other issue is also looking at the emphasis on there was a huge discourse on the regime, for example, in Iran, just like there's a huge emphasis on Hamas in Gaza. And this brings us to this understanding. It's a very colonial understanding of who gets to choose who, rules and governs these areas of the world. Because we saw when Hamas won in 2007, in a very democratic election process, that was rejected and refused by the EU. And since then, we haven't been able to hold any elections, because in the end, we're not even able to bring representatives forward, because if they are deemed as, oh, they're insufficient or too Islamist, for example, by the US and Europe, they're immediately removed. And this is problematic because it makes it difficult for us as Palestinians, as Iranis, to actually push for governance structures that are reflective of equitable communities. And this really needs to be addressed, because it also falls into the line of the emphasis on this idea of stability, right, within the framework of attacks, that it's always framed as, oh, we want to bring regional stability, but it's stability for whom? And what Iran's strategy was, and I think this was really important, is that it helped destabilize places like Europe and the US with the closure of Hormuz. And this is recognizing that it didn't have the military power that Israel and the US had, but it had at least control over certain resources that it has, like the Strait of Hormuz. And this is crucial and important because it's reflective of why regimes like Israel are sustained by the US, because it's part of a colonial empire that wants to maintain control on the resources within the Middle Eastern region specifically. So it's also discussing and thinking back about all these little details, I guess, but they're very crucial, I think, in the way this part of the world continues to be discussed, because it really needs to be first and foremost prioritized by its people, Palestinian voices, Lebanese voices, Iranian voices as well, to be pushed to the forefront in discussing it. Because part of the discussion also means holding a reckoning and holding accountability to places like the US, to places like Europe. And it also means that we get to choose that accountability. You know, the international legal framework was developed at the same time Israel was created, and it really does not apply in terms of execution on justice. So we also need to bring that forward, because we haven't even had the chance to develop our own framework of accountability, because we're focused on surviving, one thing, and two, maintaining the Western Hemisphere in its comfortable, unagitated mentality. Because accountability will mean holding that space and those populations accountable as well. But we need to start opening that avenue of developing a framework of accountability that is fit and just for here. And you know, part of that also means opening a conversation of not just dismantling colonial Israel, but also looking at the United States as a colonial state. And then, you know, that's a very important factor that I think we keep negating and ignoring, that the US is a colonial state and it needs to have its own reckoning in what it has done and continues to do as a hegemon, but a hegemon that began very much so like Israel. So I think for me, my only intervention in this conversation is just bringing up these questions that I don't necessarily have the answers to, but I think need to be taken seriously, because they do frame the trajectory of where we will go. Things will change. We all know this. But in what direction they will change will be dictated by how we frame our questions, first and foremost, and what spaces we create for developing answers to them as well. Because we need to have, you know, a more, not just intersectional understanding, but a more humble understanding of the world and how it works and the populations and communities within it. And I'll end on there.
Thank you so much, Mariam. And I was going to say, I think I'm going to steal that phrase, organized crime syndicate. I really like that. I will use that term myself, if you don't mind, to describe these guys. I think it's a perfect way. We are running over time, but the good thing about that, in terms of our question and answer, it seems like most of our questions are fairly similar in terms of the essence of what they're trying to get at. And it's actually good for this is something that I am also very curious about. And I was alluding to that earlier on when I was speaking to, or after what Professor Pape was saying as well, in terms of where we see the Zionist project going, where it's at right now, and where we see it's going. So a lot of the questions are referring to referring to the comments of Vice President Vance. His twice. Once he's speaking about how the Israelis can't bomb their way, kill their way to whatever they want to achieve, and the other one how they can't disrespect the United States like the way they're doing, and this being perceived as being, you know, showing fundamental rifts that are now occurring between the United States and Israel. And obviously, Vance making these comments with the authorization of from Trump. And so a lot of these questions are one in reference to just the Zionist project itself, is its ability. And I know that obviously Professor Pape has spoken to this, but I welcome anyone to, because I think we'll just basically wrap this up with the question, anyone that wants to give their input. So one, where do you all see the Zionist project at the present time? You know, and it's the long period of the Zionists, but particularly since the creation of the State of Israel? Where do you see it right now, and particularly the state of its lobbying capacity, both in the United States, especially in the United States, but also in the UK? And second, and again now specifically in terms of the United States, do you see some fundamental rift emerging right now, and that rift deepening in the future? Because as these questions basically are building on that, as one person put it, that the national security state or the deep state in the U.S. Is fundamentally seeing the ongoing support of Israel being contrary to its interests. So I think you guys get the flavor of what they're asking. So if anyone would like to begin, maybe Professor Pape, would you? I know you've been thinking and writing a lot on this topic,
Yes.
so we'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you all, everyone, for a very informative and excellent webinar. I think that it's important to understand that there is all the time a tension between urgency and strategy. Urgency means that when we analyze, let's say, a rift in the Republican Party, if we analyze the dramatic change in the level of solidarity in the civil society for Palestine, unfortunately, in terms of the urgency that Mariam was talking about, it doesn't have the potential to answer the urgent need to defend the Palestinians today from further genocide and ethnic cleansing. What it does have is the potential to contribute strategically to a long-term process that will lead to, I do believe, to the fall of the Zionist regime. How to navigate frustratingly between to be effective with the urgent need, while not forgetting, of course, the need to make sure that the long-term processes are attended to as well, it's not an easy question to answer. In this respect, I would say, taking, for example, the possible rift in the Republican Party, and I'm not a great expert on American policies, but I think it's quite obvious. Israel needed, from the very inception of the state, in fact, from the very inception of the Zionist movement, this idea that you can plant in the middle of the Arab world a European Jewish state against the will of the indigenous people always needed violence and coercion, as I put it before. And for that to happen, you need an international coalition to sustain it. And of course, the coalition changes in history from the one that enabled the early colonization of Palestine and the one that allows Israel to continue with its criminal policies today. And yes, there are cracks in this international coalition that Israel built, even among the members who support it for sinister reasons or interests, namely the change within either the Republican Party or even, in the multinational corporation that produce arms. And their attitude towards Israel is not, of course, because they have a different moral perspective suddenly about justice and morality and the plight of the Palestinians, but because Israel becomes more of a liability than an asset. And that is one of the positive factors that would, with other discrete processes, would bring down, I do believe, the Zionist regime. And I do hope that we're still focusing on strategy, but I wish that I could talk tomorrow to my friends in Gaza and say to them that the Van's remarks immunize them from further killing by the Israelis. And unfortunately, that would be irresponsible to say that. So we're still stuck in narrowing the gap between the urgent needs and the strategic processes. Some of us we can impact, some of us don't even depend on us. It gives us hope for change, of course, But what do we do with the urgent need? And I think some of the ideas that were put forward today by the people who participated in the webinar are worth exploring further so that the impact is immediate and not just long term. Thank you.
Thanks. Phyllis, can I ask you to comment on that?
Sure. I agree with everything that Ilan just said. I think that one of the things that we're dealing with in this question of the urgency versus the long-term strategic changes that are so vitally necessary is the question of genocide. That even in the decades of struggle against apartheid in South Africa, as horrifyingly oppressed as the South African population was, they were not facing genocide. They were not being killed in the tens or dozens or hundreds every day for years. So the urgency is greater than what we've seen. This is not the first genocide in the last 100 years, but it is the first one that has been seen by the whole world. And what emerges is so sharp as a result. You know, the movement for Palestinian rights in the US, which has grown enormously and is doing incredible work. I'm very proud of that movement. But we cannot take credit for the hundreds of thousands, really millions ultimately, of people who have poured into the streets for the first time to say no to genocide, to say ceasefire now, all of that. That was created by Israel, by the brutality of its actions that were so visible on people's phones 24/7. This had never happened before. So our challenge is to figure out how to bring that movement into a permanent component of US public opinion and US public action. We're dealing with the question of the legitimacy wars. This is where we're making incredible gains, where Israel is losing day by day its legitimacy in the world, its legitimacy as a legitimate government. What Mariam was saying about being treated as it hasn't been treated as a criminal element. Well, it's starting to. You know, the work of organizations like the Hin Rajab Foundation, which people may not know about, but it's important for places like Malaysia and Indonesia and Brazil, where Israeli soldiers traditionally go for a year off after they do their required 2 years in the military. In this case, some of them are in Gaza for 2 years, which, of course, as we know from the United States, in imperial wars, in whether it was Vietnam, whether it was in Central America, whether it was certainly in Afghanistan and Iraq, the perpetrators, the soldiers who perpetrate war crimes, come back and become victims of that moral injury when they suddenly realize what they have done. And mental illness has resulted in emotional catastrophe, rates of suicide higher than ever before. We know that that's one of the consequences. One of the aspects of that has been so extraordinary with that one organization, the Hin Rajab Foundation, is that they have been identifying people who have soldiers who have gone on their own social media bragging about what they did publicly, showing how they danced after killing Palestinians in Gaza. Horrific realities. But then they are identifying themselves and they're saying, and now we're going off to Brazil for some months at the beach to recover, right? And people have now been able to identify them and notify, in this case, the Brazilian military and the Brazilian police to say, there are now war criminals on your beaches. You might want to pick them up. And in that case, it happened in a way that the Israeli government found out about it, picked up those, I think it was 4 people who had been identified, put them on a chartered plane and flew them out of Brazil before they could be caught up in the Brazilian judicial system. But the fact that they had to face that changes this level of impunity at the personal level, including members of the Israeli Knesset. So far, they're still identifying as if it was different for the multitude of really extremist elements within the Knesset, and there are extremists even within the right-wing majority in Israel. There are some who are so extreme that even within Israel, they are isolated to some degree. And they are being sanctioned in various ways. But there is the precedent of Henry Kissinger having to call the State Department before he traveled to countries around the world to find out if there was a warrant out for his arrest. That can happen. the Pinochet precedent that for the first time challenged the vulnerability of heads of state to international law went through. Unfortunately, he died before he could be held accountable for his war crimes. But all of these things are possible, and they are now being used. These are being used as tools of civil society for the first time, not just tools of governments. That's what's changing. And that's what gives me a little bit of hope. The problem is, again, we are facing a genocide. We don't have time for the 12 or 15 years of the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa before South Africa was able to triumph over apartheid in just that period of the global movement. They had been fighting against apartheid for a century, but that movement internationally was 12, 15 years old. We don't have that much time. So I don't know what the answer is again, but I think this is the right question. We have to change the discourse, but we are facing the possibility of fascism and authoritarianism all around the world. We have to figure out how, in that context, to transform that discourse shift into an actual policy shift and make it real.
Thanks so much, Phyllis. And you're at the forefront of actually trying of those efforts in the United States. Marian, can I get you to for some brief remarks? And I will politely request Dr. Chandra for some brief closing remarks. Marian, please.
Yeah, thank you. I do fully agree also with what Dr. Elon was saying, in that there's a difference between urgency and also the strategy. And it's important to recognize short-term versus long-term. But I think also what is happening now that is so crucial and significant and important is that there is, and you can also see it in Elon's latest book, On the Brink, Israel on the Brink, and it's a shift in imagination. So now it's not only recognizing there is a need for, the Zionist regime to be dismantled and obstructed, but it's beginning to imagine an otherwise, right? And that's so crucial because part of the colonial oppression is thought. It's the psyche. It's the you believing it can't be otherwise. And to rupture that means to begin imagining a liberated Palestine, but more importantly, it means being able to finally do a roadmap, a pragmatic, practical roadmap of how that can be achieved. And I think as we also move towards mobilizing in stopping the genocide, stopping the killing, and ending the impunity that Israel and the US enjoy, is to also, make that roadmap to how a liberated Palestine, a decolonized Palestine looks like. And again, how accountability also would look like in that place. And that's what I think in terms of now is also the crucial, our imagination.
Thanks so much, Mariam. Thank you. And I'm still going to steal that organized crime syndicate. That's just lovely. Dr. Chandra, I believe you're still there. If you can offer us some closing remarks. And just one thing I wanted to ask, because it was there in the questions as well, and Professor Pape addressed it. The issue of Zionism and the potential delinking maybe of the power of the Zionists and the American empire. Do you see the possibility of that happening? And if that does happen, what would the American empire look like? So first of all, can that happen? Is there a possibility? And if it can, would the American empire still be as vicious as it has been in the past? So please, Dr. Chanda.
Well, I do not think that it's possible to delink the American empire from Zionism. Zionism is an ideology that has permeated American political life so deeply that it would be futile to think of delinking. I mean, you look at the major wars in West Asia, these were actually Palestinian wars linked to Israel. Israel was the ultimate factor. In the case of Iraq, we now know with some of the new evidence that has emerged that not just oil and other factors, it was the question of Israel. It's a war that Israel wanted. And also what's been happening in recent years is again Israel. So I think the whole Israeli agenda has penetrated the colonial soul of the US to such an extent that it's not possible to de-link. In fact, I would argue that one very important development since Gaza this time, people are beginning to see how intimate, how deeply interwoven are the interests of Israel and the United States. That I think is a good thing. In other words, I cannot see the actual liberation of Palestine or the end of the Zionist state without this precondition, which is the end of US imperialism. We should be focusing upon that. Well, of course, there are many aspects to US imperialism, but it's very important to focus on US imperialism. And you'll find that in many countries, my country included, Malaysia, people would be prepared to criticize Israel at an emotional level. But when it comes to US imperialism, US hegemony, there's certain reluctance. In other words, there has to develop a much more cogent, coherent, consistent focus on US imperialism as a way of liberating Palestine. I think that has not really happened. I'm talking of countries like Malaysia, who have got very good relations with the United States. You'll get a lot of the people who are in public life criticizing Israel, but when it comes to the question of the US and the role that the US has played, they are somewhat hesitant. And yet we know that there's no way Israeli dominance, Israeli hegemony would ever have been possible without the US. But people don't want to take on that elephant in the room, as it were, the United States, because the real fear is of US power, but also I think people are overwhelmed by the United States to some extent. So that should be part of our pursuit also. How to make them more aware of the United States, its dominance, its hegemony, and in the course of that sort of discourse, to focus upon Israel and Zionism. It's going to take a long, long while. It is really tough. This is why, while like many others, I've also made comparisons to apartheid in South Africa and so on, I know there's a different situation. Fighting apartheid, which also took a very long while, incidentally, fighting apartheid is very different because apartheid, South Africa, apartheid Britain that supported apartheid under Thatcher and so on, and the United States under Reagan supported apartheid initially. Now, in fighting apartheid, as apartheid, you did not have to contend, you did not have to come to terms with this huge monster called Israel and Israeli power. The way they're able to influence the global media, for instance. One of the reasons why the Palestinian cause, one of the many reasons why the Palestinian cause has not received that sort of backing from the global media is because of Zionist power. It's because of Israeli power. It's different. There's no way one can compare apartheid to Zionism from that point of view. Apartheid was something that we could handle, we could mobilize, we could still speak in various places and so on, even though we were strongly opposed to apartheid. But in the case of Zionism and its power, and Israel and Israel's power, it's a different thing. Where in the world, I mean, I'll just make this last point very quickly. Where in the world do you have a situation where you can criticize the United States, you can criticize Britain, and you can criticize any number of countries. But when it comes to Israel, it's different. When it comes to Zionism, it's different. You'll have to pay the price. You'll have to pay the price. And we've seen a lot of that in recent weeks. People have criticized Zionism in Israel, the way they have been targeted is very, very different from the way in which people have been targeted for criticizing apartheid in the past. So it's a very, very powerful creature that you're dealing with. It has got no parallel, actually. The power of Israel in global politics, over media, over NGOs, civil society groups. From my own very limited experience all these years, I can tell you that taking on Israel is very different from taking on anyone else or anything else. We have to keep that in mind. It doesn't mean we have to give up. We have to be aware of the lay of the land, what the situation is, and how we can proceed. It's going to be a major challenge. But at the same time, I say that we have all not done enough. All of us who have been involved in this struggle, we've not done enough. I mean, it's remarkable. I'm also very much aware of Phyllis's work and so on. But even within the academic community in the United States of America, you have voices like Phyllis and Richard Falk and others. But let us be honest, what percentage of American social scientists, academics working in the United States of America, what percentage of them are committed to the struggle for Palestinian liberation, who are willing to criticize Israel? What percentage? It is still a very small percentage. And the same thing with the student movements in the United States of America, in Britain, and so on. It's, in the ultimate analysis, a small percentage. The vast majority will not want to touch on the question of Israel and Israel's impunity and so on with the March War. For them, it's something that one should not deal with. Yes, we're all thrilled by the thousands and thousands who are coming out in the streets and so on. But it is still a small minority. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a small minority. And then goes even for the global south, believe me. Countries which are so enthusiastic about certain global issues, when it comes to targeting Israel and targeting what it has done, Palestine, they choose silence. So it is a status that Israel enjoys that is almost unique in history, that sort of impunity. And even if, let's say, the United States of America and Israel, they drifted apart. There's a little bit of tension at the moment. If, let's say, the United States goes further, or Israel in its reaction goes further, I think even a break like that, it will have an impact, but it will not change substantially the situation. Because Israel and Israeli power, it is something that's extraordinary. It's really extraordinary. Maybe others who have dealt with this for much longer, those who are more closely connected in other ways, they would have the answer. But I really feel that this is a major problem. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chandra. Phyllis, did you want to respond or no? Okay, I was just wondering. Okay, yes. Well, okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Chandra. Thank you so much to all the participants. We've gone over time, so I don't want to take any more of your time. Ustaz Ilan, thank you so much. I think Mariam has left. Thank you to Mariam, Hassan Al, Khalisha. There you are, Ustaz Ilan. This was a wonderful panel, not just because of the wonderful intellectual insights, but because all of you are involved in the struggle, have always been involved in the praxis of all of you and what we continue to learn. So thank you so much for this wonderful webinar. It will be used not just for the participants that are here today, but for the participants, our students, and everyone that will use this webinar to hopefully motivate us towards a very urgent action that we need to be undertaking to address genocide, these wars, invasions, and the ongoing cruelties and injustices. So thank you so much for this webinar, and take care. From all of us at MLN, take care and bye-bye. Thank you.